Let me tell you something about humans. Something the Galactic Cooperative of enlightened species spent 14,000 years refusing to accept. They bleed, they break, they run out of food, water, oxygen, hope, and then somehow, impossibly, stubbornly, they keep going anyway. I know. I watched it happen. I, Vreth-Olu, Senior Observation Officer of the Collective Science Division, recorded every agonizing second of it. And I still cannot explain it without my translator implant making sounds that do not exist in any known language. Let me start from the beginning. The year was 2031. Humanity had been a registered galactic species for exactly 6 years, 4 months, and 17 days. They had joined the cooperative with that particular energy of theirs, you know the one. The energy of someone who shows up to a formal dinner in muddy boots, grins at everyone, and somehow gets invited back. The cooperative had welcomed them officially with a ceremony that lasted 9 hours. The humans sat through 4 of those hours before one of them, a short woman named Priya Vos, leaned over to her colleague and whispered loudly enough for 3 nearby alien delegations to hear, "Do you think they will feed us at any point during this, or is this the whole thing?" The Zalkari delegation to her left pretended not to understand. They understood perfectly. They just did not have an appropriate response. That was humanity, in summary. Loud, hungry, alarmingly comfortable with discomfort. 6 years later, the cooperative made its greatest mistake. Not out of malice, out of condescension, which, if anything, is worse. The Tarath Expanse, as it was formerly called, was not on any approved colonization map. It was a region of 3 star systems that the cooperative had catalogued, assessed, and quietly shelved. Too unstable, too resource-poor, too far from established supply lines. The kind of place you mark with a polite warning symbol and never discuss again. The humans looked at that warning symbol and apparently interpreted it as a suggestion. A colony vessel, the Durga's Reach, departed from Earth's orbital station on a Tuesday. They filed the appropriate paperwork. They received the appropriate responses, which included 17 separate cautionary notices, 2 formal objections from the Cooperative's Colonial Ethics Board, and 1 strongly worded message from Ambassador Veskhtaro of the Zalkari, who had met humans before and had a feeling about this. The humans acknowledged all 17 notices, replied politely to the objections, and sent Ambassador Veskhtaro a basket of something called dried mangoes, which he later admitted were excellent. Then they went anyway. 842 humans aboard a vessel that the cooperative's engineers had privately described as aggressively optimistic in its structural assumptions. Their destination, Tarath 3, a planet with a breathable atmosphere, liquid water, and soil that could theoretically support agriculture if you were creative, desperate, and did not mind occasional volcanic events. I was assigned to observe. Purely academically, the cooperative expected to retrieve survivors within 18 months. They were not entirely wrong about that. The first thing that happened when Durga's Reach achieved orbit around Tarath 3 was that the landing shuttle's primary thruster array decided to have what humans later described as a moment. I watched through the orbital sensor relay as the shuttle descended at an angle that made my secondary heart do something it had never done before. The humans inside were, according to my audio feed, arguing about whether the impact zone looked like a good spot or a great spot. They landed sideways into a hillside, 11 injuries, 0 fatalities. The humans climbed out of the wreckage, assessed the situation, and the colony's appointed engineer, a tall man named Dayo Ferreira, looked at the shuttle and said, "Well, that is not flying again. Good thing we are already here." They laughed. They actually laughed. I filed my first report to the cooperative that evening. I titled it, "Initial Observations, Human Psychological Response to Catastrophic Circumstances." My supervisor read it and sent back 3 words. "Are they crying?" I replied, "No, they are building." Within 72 hours, the 842 colonists of Tarath 3 had established a perimeter camp, identified 2 freshwater sources, catalogued local vegetation for edibility, and begun constructing what they optimistically called the town center, which was a collection of prefabricated panels arranged around a fire pit. The fire pit was not in the original colony plan. Nothing about what followed was in the original colony plan. Tarath 3 had seasons. This was known. What the cooperative survey teams had not adequately communicated, because their survey had lasted 11 days and taken place entirely in the planet's mild mid-cycle, was that Tara 3's seasons were not gradual suggestions. They were announcements, loud ones, the kind that arrive without warning, bring all their luggage, and rearrange your furniture. 41 days after landing, Tara 3's cold season arrived. I have studied meteorological events across 312 inhabited worlds. I have observed ice storms on Velok Prime. I have documented the pressure hurricanes of the Orath Belt. I have, in my professional career, witnessed weather events that rewrote colonial charters and ended settlement programs that had been running for decades. What descended on the human colony that night was, by those standards, a moderately serious cold front. The temperature dropped from 19 degrees above freezing to 31 degrees below it in 6 hours, with winds that averaged 90 kilometers per hour, and seemed to have a personal grievance with anything that had been built in the last 40 days. 4 of the prefabricated structures collapsed. The heating unit in the medical bay failed. The town center's fire pit was, briefly, an extremely enthusiastic fire pit, and then it was not a fire pit at all. I sent an emergency relay to the Cooperative. Colony under severe environmental stress. Recommend immediate extraction consideration. The response took 4 hours, as all Cooperative communications from this distance did. Noted, initiating assessment protocol. Please continue observation. The humans did not have 4 hours to wait. They had each other, and apparently that was enough. What followed was not organized. Let me be clear about that. It was not the product of calm, rational planning by experienced crisis management professionals. It was loud and frantic and involved a significant amount of shouting, but it worked. A woman named Oksana Brel, who was the colony's botanist and who had no formal engineering training whatsoever, figured out that the collapsed prefab panels could be stacked against the surviving structures to create windbreaks. She communicated this idea at maximum volume across the camp frequency. A teenager named Marcus, who was 16 and had come on this mission because his parents were colonists, and he had not been given a vote on the matter, organized 11 other young colonists into what he called a supply chain to move insulation materials from the shuttle wreckage to the medical bay. He did this while wearing 3 jackets and someone else's boots because his had gotten wet. Dayo Ferreira, the engineer who had laughed at the crashed shuttle, crawled into the heating unit housing during a 90-kilometer-per-hour wind event with a repair kit, a headlamp, and what his colleagues later described as an extremely calm expression that did not match the situation at all. The heating unit came back online at hour 4, 53 minutes before the Cooperative's acknowledgement of my distress relay arrived. Assessment complete. Human colony experiencing expected environmental adaptation challenges. Continue monitoring. I stared at that message for a long time. Then I looked back at the sensor feed, where 842 humans were huddled in 3 surviving structures, wrapped in anything they could find, eating emergency rations and apparently telling each other stories. In the middle of all that, I made a note in my observation log. It was not a scientific note. It was more of a personal one. It said, "I do not think the Cooperative understands what it is observing." By day 60, the colony had rebuilt, not just repaired, rebuilt. They had learned from the storm. The new structures were lower, angled against the prevailing wind direction, connected by covered walkways that Oksana Brel had designed and that Dayo Ferreira had called structurally creative, in the tone of someone who meant something more complicated. They had mapped the local vegetation, identified 7 species that were edible with preparation, and begun experimental cultivation plots. Marcus, the teenager, had apparently become the colony's unofficial expert on local soil composition because he had nothing else to do during the storm and had read every geological file on the colony database. He was 16. He had become an expert in alien soil biology because he was bored and cold. I reported this to the Cooperative. I received a response asking me to quantify the colony's probability of long-term survival for the upcoming review. I sat with that question for a while. The Cooperative's standard survival metrics measured things like resource availability, structural integrity of colony infrastructure, population health index, and projected agricultural yield. By most of those metrics, the Tara 3 colony was marginal, borderline, the kind of numbers that generated yellow indicators on the Colonial Development Board's displays and prompted politely worded conversations about reassessing settlement viability. But there was no metric for what I had watched happen during that storm. No measurement for the speed at which these creatures reorganized under pressure. No formula to calculate the value of a 16-year-old becoming a soil expert because he decided to be useful. No way to quantify Oksana Brel's windbreak idea or Dayo Ferreira's crawl into a broken heater during a storm. The Cooperative's models assumed that survival was primarily a question of resources. Have enough of the right things in the right places and a colony lives. Lack them, and it does not. Humans appeared to operate on a different assumption entirely. Their assumption, as best I could interpret it, was that survival was a question of what you did with what you had, that resources were a starting point, not a ceiling, that a broken shuttle was not a failed landing but a source of materials, that a collapsed structure was not a loss but a windbreak waiting to be assembled. It was not optimism exactly. Optimism implies a belief that things will get better on their own. What humans had was something more active than that, something more stubborn. They believed, apparently on a cellular level, that things could be made better by them, right now, with whatever was available. I did not have a metric for that. I wrote in my log, at the end of day 60, as the colony's lights came on across the Tara 3 plain and the humans moved through their rebuilt settlement, doing ordinary things in an extraordinary place. Probability of long-term survival. Unknown by standard models. Then I added, below it, in a notation I marked as personal and non-official, suspected, tokens name D-04. I did not know then how much higher it was about to get. That would come in part 2, when Tara 3 gave them something far worse than a storm, and when the rest of the galaxy finally started to pay attention. Day 93 on Tara 3, I, Vreth-Olu, Senior Observation Officer of the Collective Science Division, had by this point filed 47 observation reports. My supervisor had read at a generous estimate 3 of them. The Colonial Development Board had acknowledged 2. Ambassador Vesk Taro of the Zalkari had personally requested copies of all 47, which I found both flattering and slightly concerning. He had met humans before. He knew something the board did not. He knew that when humans got quiet, it was not because things were going well. The colony had been quiet for 11 days, not silent. Humans are physically incapable of silence. There was still noise, work noise, tool noise, the particular sound of Dayo Ferreira explaining something technical to someone who had stopped listening 3 sentences in, but the frequency of their communications had dropped. The laughter in the evening gatherings had a different quality to it, shorter, like people conserving something. I reviewed the colony's internal logs. I had access to their communication network, a fact the Cooperative had not bothered to mention to the colonists, which I had decided not to think too hard about from an ethical standpoint. The logs told me what the quiet was about. The 7 edible plant species they had identified were not producing at the expected rate. The soil in the cultivation plots was yielding results that Marcus, the 16-year-old who had accidentally become a soil biologist, described in a report to the Colony Council as technically not 0, but also not good. 3 of the colony's food synthesizers, which were supposed to supplement natural yields through the first growing season, had been operating at reduced capacity since the storm. The 4th had stopped working entirely on day 81. They had food. They were not starving. But the margin between what they had and what they needed was narrowing in a direction that the colony's leadership was clearly trying to manage without causing a general panic. Colony Administrator Priya Vos, the same woman who had asked about dinner at the Cooperative ceremony 6 years ago, was holding daily council meetings that lasted 3 hours and ended with everyone walking out looking like they had done mathematics they had not enjoyed. I sent a relay to the Cooperative. Colony experiencing food production shortfall. Situation stable but trending negatively. Recommend supply dispatch consideration. The response took 4 hours. Request logged. Supply dispatch requires Colonial Development Board approval. Current board session convenes in 31 days. Situation will be assessed at that time. 31 days. I looked at the colony's projected food reserves. I looked at 31 days. I looked at 842 humans who had already survived a shuttle crash and a storm, and 60 days of rebuilding, and were now doing quiet, careful mathematics about rations. I filed an urgent escalation notice. I marked it Priority Classification 1, which in the Cooperative system was the highest available urgency designation. The response came back in 2 hours instead of 4, which I suppose indicated progress. Priority escalation noted. Board emergency session possible if colony survival probability drops below 15%. Please provide updated survival probability assessment. I stared at that message for a long time. Then I looked at my log entry from day 60, the one that said suspected tokens, name and very high. I understood then that the Cooperative and I were watching completely different things. On day 97, Oksana Brel found something. She had been running soil tests in the eastern sector, 3 kilometers from the main settlement, looking for cultivation sites with better mineral profiles. She was doing this alone, which was technically against colony protocol, and which she had clearly decided was a protocol designed for situations less urgent than this one. What she found was not a better cultivation site. It was a cave system. Vreth-Olu's geology was volcanic, which the colony had been managing around since arrival. Active volcanic activity was minimal in their region, which was why it had been selected. But the geological history of the area had left behind something interesting, something the Cooperative's 11-day survey had not gone deep enough to find. The cave system extended approximately 2 kilometers into the hillside, and running through it, heated by residual geothermal activity from ancient volcanic channels, was water. Mineral-rich, temperature-stable, flowing water, not remarkable on its own. They had surface water sources. What was remarkable was what was growing in that water, along the cave walls, in the warm mineral-saturated environment that had been sitting there, undisturbed, for approximately 40,000 years. Oksana Brel stood in that cave with her sample kit and her headlamp, and she took 17 samples, and then she sat down on the cave floor, and apparently did not move for 20 minutes. Her suit telemetry showed normal vital signs throughout. She was not injured. She was not in distress. She was, I believe, having what humans call a moment. Then she stood up, activated her communicator, and said in a voice that was working very hard to sound calm, "Council, I need everyone on Channel 3, right now. I found something." The cave algae, as the colony came to call it, was not immediately edible. Let me be clear about that, because the story could give a misleading impression of convenience that would not be accurate. It required processing. Significant processing, the kind that involved a lot of trial and error, and at least 2 incidents that Dayo Ferreira described as educational in the tone he used for things that had been briefly on fire. It required 2 colonists with biochemistry backgrounds, a woman named Fatou and a man named Riku working 18-hour days for 11 days to develop a preparation method that rendered it non-toxic and nutritionally useful. It required Marcus, somehow again, to figure out that the cave's geothermal water could be redirected through a modified section of the shuttle's cooling pipe system to create a controlled cultivation environment outside the cave, expanding production capacity by a factor of 6. He was 16. He figured this out by looking at a pipe and thinking about it for a while. I have submitted a formal note to the Cooperative's Xenobiology Division, suggesting that human adolescence may represent a scientifically significant phenomenon that warrants dedicated study. I have not received a response. The point is that the cave algae was not a solution. It was a possibility, and the humans turned it into a solution through work and stubbornness, and Fatou not sleeping enough, and Riku developing what his colleagues described as a deeply personal relationship with failure that he was handling really well, all things considered. By day 119, the colony had a supplemental food source that covered 38% of their caloric shortfall. Not enough on its own, but enough to change the mathematics. The quiet lifted, not all at once, gradually, like a pressure releasing. On day 122, the Colonial Development Board held its scheduled session. They reviewed my reports, or at least the summaries of my reports, and assessed the Tariff 3 colony's survival probability. They determined it was 63%. Marginal. They approved a supply dispatch for the following quarter. They noted in their official record that the colony was performing within acceptable parameters for a high-difficulty settlement environment. I read that assessment and experienced a sensation for which I do not have a precise clinical term. In human language, I believe the closest approximation is the feeling of watching someone describe a painting they have never actually seen. 63%. Within acceptable parameters. I looked at my sensor feed, at 842 humans who had crashed, frozen, nearly starved, rebuilt twice, and invented an agricultural system in a geothermal cave using shuttle parts and 16-year-old intuition. 63%. Ambassador Vreth-Olu sent me a personal communication on day 125, not an official channel, a personal one. Officer Vreth-Olu, I have been following your reports with significant interest. I have a question. In your professional assessment, what is the colony's actual survival probability? I considered the question carefully, then I wrote back, Ambassador, I have been attempting to answer that question since day 3. I have concluded that the standard probability models are not equipped to assess this particular colony. The models assume that survival is determined by available resources and environmental conditions. The Tarith-3 colonists appear to operate under a different model entirely, one where survival is determined primarily by what they are willing to do. I paused. Then I added, in my observation log I have noted the colony's probability as unknown by standard models. Personally, I now believe the more accurate answer is higher than whatever number you put in front of them. Vreth-Olu's response came back quickly. For a 4-hour relay, I suspected as much. I have been making a similar argument to the board for 6 years. They find it difficult to quantify. Yes, I replied. Humans are difficult to quantify. Indeed, that is precisely what makes them remarkable. On day 140, the supply ship arrived. Early. Someone at the Cooperative had apparently actually read one of my reports. The supply ship's crew was Zalkari, which I suspect was not a coincidence. They were professional, efficient, and visibly unprepared for what they found. They had been expecting a struggling colony, marginal survival indicators, possibly some degree of psychological deterioration from prolonged stress and resource scarcity. What they found was a settlement, not a camp, not a survival situation, a settlement with organized structures, functioning agriculture, a cave-based supplemental cultivation system that their xenobotanist spent 45 minutes documenting with the focused energy of someone who had found something they did not expect to find. They found Priya Voss, who walked out to meet them and immediately asked if the ship had brought anything with flavor, because the cave algae was nutritious but honest-to-goodness boring. They found Dayo Ferreira giving a structural tour of the rebuilt colony to anyone who would follow him, which was everyone, because he had strong feelings about load-bearing design in volcanic soil and was not keeping them to himself. They found Marcus, who was sitting in the geothermal cultivation bay writing notes in a journal that was apparently a comprehensive record of everything he had learned about Tarith-3's soil biology. He looked up at the Zalkari crew and said, "Are any of you geologists? I have some questions." None of them were geologists. Marcus asked the questions anyway. The supply crew's official report to the Cooperative described the Tarith-3 colony as unexpectedly advanced in settlement development relative to projected timeline, which was, in diplomatic terms, the Cooperative's way of saying that they had expected to find something much worse and were not entirely sure how to process finding something much better. I submitted my final Phase 1 observation report on day 141. It was long. Longer than any report I had submitted before. I included everything. The crashed shuttle and Dayo Ferreira's laugh, the storm and Marcus's supply chain and Oksana Brel's windbreaks, the food shortfall and the cave and Fatou Dieng's 18-hour days and Riku Sato's deeply personal relationship with failure. At the end of it I wrote a conclusion. It said, "The Galactic Cooperative of Enlightened Species has, for 14,000 years of civilization, solved the problem of survival primarily by avoiding it. We build in safe locations. We colonize stable worlds. We do not go where conditions are uncertain, because uncertain conditions produce uncertain outcomes, and we have, as a collective culture, decided that uncertainty is the enemy of progress. The humans of Tarith-3 have demonstrated a different relationship with uncertainty. They do not avoid it. They do not consider it an enemy. They walk into it with crashed shuttles and food shortfalls and storms, and they look at each other, and they start building. What advanced civilizations forgot about survival is this. Survival is not a condition, it is a practice. It is not something you achieve by having enough resources in a stable enough environment. It is something you do every day with whatever you have, in whatever conditions you find yourself in. Humans have not forgotten this. I am not certain they ever knew it as a theory. I think for them, it has always simply been a habit. I submitted the report. I returned to my observation post. On the sensor feed, The colony's lights burned across the Tariff 3 plane. Inside those lights, 842 humans were doing what they always did, working, arguing, laughing, eating algae they had grown in a cave using shuttle parts and stubbornness, building, as they always built, something out of whatever they had. I made one final note in my personal log. It said, "Next quarter, the Cooperative will send a formal assessment team to evaluate the Tariff 3 colony's viability. I intend to be present for that assessment." Then I added, "I intend to watch their faces when they see it." That, I thought, was going to be worth the 4-hour relay delay.